What is going on, everyone? So it's time to record my film reveal video. This is where I take a look at my film for the very first time for my trip to the Redwoods. So I've got my light box here, I've got a camera overhead, and I got a box of my film over to my left here. And it's been 6 days since I got back from this trip. And I gotta say, I'm definitely a little bit nervous about this one because the Redwoods, I'm still very new to that location, and there's so much to learn in terms of the subject, in terms of the exposures, in terms of all the things to look for. So I don't quite know what to expect, but I'm hoping I have something decent here. So let's go ahead and take a look at the film. Now, I have 6 sheets of transparency film, 6 sheets of color negative film, and all the film is in protective sleeves so I can handle it with my fingers here. So let's look at image number 1. Now this also happens to be the first scene that I photographed when I was at the Redwoods this year. So this is just before it started to rain. It was really nice and overcast. And this is a scene that I found last year when I went there. I filmed some video here. And I love this tree right here and all the nicely soft-lit backlit leaves. A little trail leading to this really cool bridge that has some plants growing along the steps there. Now this is on Fuji Provia 100F, which you can tell based on that notch pattern right there. And I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with this one. It's a little tricky for the exposure because there were some bright areas up in here, some really dark areas in there. Now to my eye, this area right here was so dark it was really hard to see much of anything. So let's see how it looks with the loop. I actually have decent detail in there. I mean, it does go pure black, but it looks quite natural. And if I look at some of the leaves near the top, I'm definitely threading the needle in terms of the exposure. This was taken with my 240mm lens, which is equivalent to maybe like somewhere between a 28 and a 35mm. And for this one, I focused slightly behind this branch right here. That way I'll get some of the ferns in here in pretty good focus. I have sufficient focus back here on this bridge. It's not like tack sharp, but it's fine. But I love this shape of the tree here. I love the path leading into it. And I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with that. It definitely very much captures the feeling of being there. And also being able to look at all those little details in there. This is where large format is so fun. So I'm definitely quite satisfied with that. Now I've learned not to use Velvia when shooting in the Redwoods because the saturation is so strong already. And the color palette of Provia handles this really well. It's very natural. It's not over the top at all. It's very, very natural. So very happy with that. And the next one is the same scene. I believe we have about the same exposure. The way I'm gonna check is to look at these areas with the loop. I'm pretty sure it's the same. They are very similar. I'd say this one might be a hair brighter, but we're talking like almost undetectably brighter. But that looks good. Now for me, one of the goals with photography is to take a photo that conveys the feeling of being there. And for me, this very much conveys that feeling. So at least from that standpoint, it looks to be a decent shot. All right, up next, I'm a little dark. So I shot this scene on Provia, on E100 Kodak, and also on Ektar. So I should have some options. Now I'm a little dark down in here, but I'm also pushing the limits up top here. So according to my light meter, I was darn near +2 up here, which is really pushing the limits of slide film. And down here, I was basically at -2, which is pushing the limits on the other side. So technically,
I actually have a pretty decent exposure, because I'm really pushing the limits of those highlights. This might be one where color negative does better, though as I look through this with the loupe, I gotta say that it's actually pretty decent in terms of the exposure, but it's a tough scene. Now, I was a little nervous with this composition because you have such a strong diagonal emphasis, and it's a very looming sort of subject. And it's okay, it definitely conveys that. It definitely has that sort of that looming sense to it. But I'll be really curious to see how this one does on color negative film. Because I'm not quite as in love with it as I thought I might be. Some of the concerns when setting up the composition, so there's a tree right here and then a tree right here. Though when you just glance at this, this looks like a limb coming from that tree, but I believe that is actually a completely separate tree. But I gotta say, Pro V handled it pretty decently, though it's a little more chaotic than I would like, and it doesn't really have that feeling of calm that I was going for. It was actually raining when I was shooting this, but I was in the rain shadow of this really large redwood tree. Now this will be an interesting comparison because this one is E100. And I believe I used about the same exposure, but we can see that this one's a little darker. Part of that is because I didn't quite know what to do when it comes to reciprocity failure. And clearly this looks like it was suffering a little bit from reciprocity failure. You can definitely see a difference in the exposure there, with this one being pretty bright right here. There's actually pretty good exposure there, but then you get a little dark down in here. So it's definitely nice to see the E100G, or not E100G, but the E100. I think E100G is what they used to call it. It's definitely good to see the E100 and how it compares to Pro V, but this isn't like an apples and oranges things because I don't know what to correct for with reciprocity with that one. A little dark on the exposure. But again, I have a color negative, so that should be good. It's also a very aggressive notch pattern on the E100. So you definitely feel that with your fingers when you're loading the film. All right, 2 more sheets of slide film. So this definitely went a bit on the cold side. And also, okay, so this is really pushing the limits of slide film. You have some pretty bright areas here. You have some really dark areas back there. The other concern was getting a clear enough reflection. And I did pretty decent with that. The color overall is definitely quite blue. I'm pushing the very limits of the exposure in terms of some of these rocks here and also some of the darkness there. So it's probably not an ideal scene for slide film because I'm really pushing the limits in terms of some of these highlights. Shadows actually aren't horrible. It's not bad. But I suspect it's gonna scan a little ugly. This is actually a lot bluer than I thought it would be. To my eye, it was definitely warmer. It's okay. I'm hoping the color negative film does better for this one. And I have another version of this one as well. Now this one has a light leak. That's an odd light leak. Get that right there. That's odd. I'm actually not quite sure where that light leak would come from. Because if it's from the film holder separating a little bit when you put in a dark slide, it's usually not like that, but it's coming from the corner. Just to double check, I might have to double check my bellows just to make sure. But it's a little troubling to see that. But again, my highlights are getting a little cooked here. They're getting a little bright. The shadows are a little too dark, and the light's a little bluish and flat. I was hoping this one would be better. because it's a composition I really like. But again, I have this on color negative film, but on the color negative film one, it's an 8-second exposure as opposed to 2. So my reflection might get a little softer. But that right there is something I'm going to need to look into, because light leaks are not good. Okay, so now it's time for the color negative film. And this is going to be a little tougher for you guys to see what it all amounts to, but at least you should be able to recognize some of these scenes. So here's that scene with that diagonal tree. And in terms of detail, I can tell you right now I have good detail in the shadows because it's not just completely clear right there. And I have decent detail up there in the highlights. So this will definitely be one that's interesting to scan. So this is Kodak Ektar, and for those of you, if you're new to shooting large format, for a lot of scenes I do recommend shooting color negative film and slide film at the same time, because you kind of get the best of both worlds. And especially since this is a new environment for me to photograph, having both options can be a lifesaver at times. So this is almost certain to be better than the slide film versions of these, but it'll be a good one to scan. Next up, all right, so here's the color neg version of the first scene, and this will also be one that I'll want to scan. I have a little better detail in the dark parts of the trunk there than on the slide film. And so yeah, so it looks actually to be a pretty good exposure. And it'll be interesting to see how this compares to the slide film, but definitely good to have that one backed up on color negative. So this will be one of 2 photos. This is a completely experimental photograph. I was walking through this grove of redwood trees, and I noticed that in the early evening, this one tree was lit up pretty nicely by the sun, but all the trees around it are really dark. And so this is severely pushing the limits of the film. And this probably will not look good when I scan it, because you have some bright areas of sky, you have some really dark trees, direct sunlight hitting this central tree right here. So this is completely experimental. I really don't expect much from it, but that's how we learn. So, and I'll have one more of those as well, which, here we go. So I basically did a different exposure. So I made this one a bit of a longer exposure, and you can see how I'm gaining a lot more detail in the shadows here. So here the shadows are basically gone. Here I have good shadows, and then on this one you have it where the highlights are getting a little bright, but I still see detail there. So between the two of these, just based on how the negatives look, I would think that this one probably has better detail. Now I do see some wind motion there, but maybe that won't look horrible. Maybe it will look horrible, we'll see. At this point in the trip, I was just happy to expose some film. But sometimes it is nice to experiment a little bit. And that sky is gonna be like pure white. That is a really dark part of the negative. All right, this is a scene I found within my campsite. So it was a harsh, sunny day, and I had eaten lunch, and I was just killing some time before going kayaking in the river. And I found this interesting scene with a redwood in the foreground and then some redwoods in the background that were smaller. And you can't really tell from this, but they're all backlit with some really strong greens back there. And focus, I knew, was going to be very difficult. In terms of the exposure, I knew that would be difficult as well. This is purely experimental, just to see how this color negative film would handle a situation of strong backlighting with also some deep shadows there. So completely experimental. I'll look forward to seeing how it scans, but it was mostly just an experiment. All right, our final sheet is that same rock scene. Now this one will be interesting to see how this scans. This was an 8-second long exposure, which is a pretty long exposure given that there was some wind going on. And so I'm curious about... So the bush that's growing there actually seems to be pretty decent, not a lot of wind movement there. And I also appear to have pretty decent detail with the trees in the background. Decent with that. So this will be very interesting to see how this one scans, and also no light leak there. So that's very good. So overall, I definitely like the first scene that I photographed. I really like how that one turned out. I'll be very curious to see how the color negative versions scan, because that's really where the other potential images are going to be. But I learned quite a bit on this trip, and I was able to explore quite a bit. So even though I didn't shoot a ton of photos, I'm glad I was able to find some subjects. I was able to learn more about the location, and I definitely look forward to going back there. But now I need to get these scanned in, see how they all turned out. But I want to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you around next time. If you enjoy this ad-free and clickbait-free content and want to help me live my dream, a voluntary contribution of just $24 a year helps keep my gas tank full and my film freezer stocked. For more information on how to support me and my work, please visit the donation section of my website at benhorn.com/donate. I also have prints in my portfolio box set available on my website. You can find a direct link down below in the show notes. Thanks in advance for your support.